speak quite enough for myself. So I am Carina Westling and as Senior Lecturer at Bournemouth University in Cross-Platform Media. I'll be talking about immersive experience as a kind of sublime aesthetic for design and media. If I get too quiet at some point, please let the host know, because I'm known to sometimes speak a little quietly. My current research and collaborations, first, a little bit about that. I live in Brighton, which is of course another coastal city with plenty of distractions for the adventurous of spirit. There's a slightly more better lit photograph of myself in the little very short bio. I have specialized as a practitioner and a researcher in the domains of ideas generation and development, developing discipline-specific knowledge and methods, and a theoretical framework for interrogating the effectiveness and emotional impact of designed immersive environments and non-linear story worlds. Brighton is, of course, the home of debauchery in Britain. I prefer to think of it as, in one sense, the home of immersion, because if you go to Brighton Pavilion, especially the music room, which is my favourite venue in there, it is clear that it is indeed designed to immerse, to overwhelm, and to create the sort of jaws dropped wow experiences in people who come in there. And of course, it's a music room. It is designed to envelop you, not just in sights and this kind of richness of pattern and color and the enormous scalloped gilt dome above you, but also music, which is one of the most immersive senses. I am the author of Immersion and Participation in Punchdrunk's Theatrical Worlds, which I've revisited lately, and it's actually not a bad book. I quite recommend it. I was quite fed up with it after submitting and having it printed, as one is. But I have revisited it, and I have to say it holds. So I'm very pleased with its birth into the world, and if you should see it fit to pursue it, it is available in our library and also from your usual booksellers. First, a little bit about the genealogy of immersive experience. So it's quite, it's been bandied about between the art world, the theatre world, and the HCI world, and as tends to happen in those kinds of contexts, there's a little bit of promiscuity in regards to its conceptual clarity. In HCI and games literature, it's often sort of seen as a kind of the far end of engagement, a complete engrossment or immersion in something. For the purpose of art and other types of design, that is slightly non-specific and not a particularly effective way of thinking about it. You know, it's, yeah, I have opinions. I prefer to anchor it in the trajectory that goes from via experience and art and theatre and plastic arts, particularly, that started earlier in the earlier decades of the 20th century, but becomes particularly salient from Ilya Kabakov's work, Char Davis, of course, in VR in 1995, Punchdrunk from 2000, etc. This later part of the 20th century, broadly speaking, forms what Claire Bishop calls the participatory turn. She provides a very useful ways of thinking about audiences in this context, in a sort of performance manner, in the performance literature. We also have Ray Chow and the idea of capture, which is useful across the arts. And I have worked with these and similar concepts in the formation of my own understanding of immersive media as a cross-platform and cross-media, transmedia phenomenon. I do not, and this is another area where I diverge from the HCI literature, I do not consider immersion as something that happens to adult audiences. My empirical research with Punchdrunk and other makers certainly confirm that position. It is a voluntary capture, and therein lies the usefulness of Chow's model, or suspension of disbelief, which is, of course, a term with much longer legacy. It's a compact struck between the audiences or between the maker and their audiences that must be maintained for the duration of the event. This has implications for all manner of design thinking. In the aesthetic frame, the empirical research I just referred to and on which the book is based also indicates that immersion in this particular rendition is very closely aligned to the sublime experience, which is, as you probably know, one of the awe, a sense of vertigo, the possibility of dissolution, and in the postmodern sense, or the sort of the latter half of the 20th century sense, it's less the romantic sublime so much, although it carries on that legacy, but moving towards the boundary between reason and no sense. And a sense of failure, the aesthetics of failure come in, particularly in the post-World War II years, to enrich the romantic sublime with a dimension that sort of transcends both modernism and postmodernism as an aesthetic. And Rancière writes really well on this, and it's probably, in the aesthetic sense, is the closest frame I've come to actually usefully match what I have seen in my empirical research with makers and audiences. So there are aesthetic and ethical implications. And as mentioned, Rancière has been important for my theoreticization of the immersive experience. Other important theorists are, of course, the play theorists, Huizinga, Caillois, and to some extent Derrida. Well, actually, very importantly, Derrida, but Derrida's understanding of structure then needs to be understood as a form of boundary, a form of limiting structure. And that melds the idea, Derrida's idea of free play with the idea of play in Huizinga and Caillois, etc., play theorists' understanding of it. So that play and boundaries or limitations by structure exist in a bond. Play is emergent out, is an emergent quality from boundaries and structures under certain conditions of possibility. This then becomes relevant to the sublime experience and its dependence on frames and the containment of the possibility of dissolution that Rancière writes about, and other theoreticians who have written about the sublime experience. So nobody actually gets a kick out of falling down a precipice and tumbling to their death. Toying with the idea, aestheticized, framed, removed, can become hedonic. And in this interplay between the sublime experience and the theory of play and free play is a very useful intersection that works really well with immersive experience. Artaud and the theatre of cruelty as an alternative strand within modernist theatre is also very useful. Rather than the Brechtian approach to the fourth wall, Artaud looks particularly at the audience subject position. That, of course, is relevant to immersive presentation forms, such as one employed by Punchdrunk. So immersion is a property of the audience experience, in my thinking. Its site and medium may vary quite considerably. Other ideas that have been useful include the scenes of dissensus that Rancière talks about, where you design, you create in theatre or in performance or public events, scenes where conventional relations, hierarchies, and distinctions may dissolve. Here, of course, we have the Bachtin's, the Carnivalesque also plays in. The bishops, the artificial hells that came in with surrealist, I think it was the Surrealist Exhibition of Paris in 1921. That's when you see the beginning of this kind of designed event that disturbs or upsets the status quo. So there is in the 20th century more of a focus on different types of emotions that are highly relevant to what we now understand to be immersive experience. This whole historical legacy informs a functional understanding of immersion that really can be constructive for designers and makers, particularly when you think about the audience and how to conceptualize and think the audience as we move towards and beyond the obsession with demographic data. Burnt City, a little whistle-stop tour of things that have been going on recently. Burnt City is being built right now. It's opening in March 2022. Unfortunately, I can't share any images with you from the production. It is closed due to COVID to only critical staff on the production. I have interviewed members of the company longingly in lieu of actually participating, but I am obviously going as soon as I possibly can. I did take part as a designer in the third day, autumn, which was a live stream, a 12-hour live stream by Punchdrunk in collaboration with HBO and Sky in 2020 in October. So in the midst of lockdown, they had planned to have a live event, live episode of this series with an audience on an island in the Essex estuary, but obviously had to completely scrap and refashion those plans for an entirely remote audience watching a 12-hour live stream that I have some screenshots from. So in this context, the ideas of what is a functional immersive compact are strangely illustrated, even though audiences were distributed around the world and locked to their screens watching this thing unfold for 12 hours in absolutely glacial pace at times. So here we have Jude Law to the left and his twin actor. They've just been, this is sort of a mirror of the crucifixion, and they stand there on little platforms out in the sea in October, and it's fairly cold, and then they plunge into the water. So it's very slow and very dramatic at the same time. So this idea of an agreement or a compact needs to traverse the interface. It needs to communicate across the interface. And somehow this seems to carry through all the different projects I've worked with, all the different companies I've researched and whose work I have experienced. There is this utter commitment and this understanding that you cannot expect your audience to invest of themselves more than you do. And that is sort of the fundament of this compact. You need to sort of, invest, cough up a bit of lung, if you will. And certainly Jude Law does that. And then you have, in terms of the design and the art and the craft of acting or designing or making the game or writing the book or whatever it is, the compact needs to be sustained. The experience needs and must be sustained for the duration of the experience. Therein lies another fact that I will return to very briefly. This type of commitment must be imminent to detail. So it is inside the making of it, the utter commitment to absolute detail. That is what signifies design and production that really works for the audiences. This commitment to detail communicates across the interface. I have never seen this being disproven. Nobody else writes about it. It absolutely seems to work across a range of platforms and a range of contexts, and it's absolutely fascinating. So here we have Jude Law. He's just dragged a boat across a sort of pebbly beach for the better part of an hour, and he's absolutely exhausted. And he confirmed in interviews later that he was weeping tears of pain and exhaustion. And yeah, I mean, it's voyeuristic for sure, but it was absolutely riveting, and it absolutely worked as an experience, which I personally didn't expect. The company had to completely redo this entire thing for live stream a live streamed performance rather than a participatory event with the audiences on site. Very important to remember about this immanence. There are some sort of thought tricks that designers fall prey to on a regular basis. The preformed assumptions about what will take place, about what the experience, what the audiences will experience or do, they may be one of the biggest stumbling blocks. Successful immersive design is designed for encounters, and encounters are quite level. There's always the possibility of things going drastically wrong. There must be space for agency. There must be space for immanence within the experience. That is not actually the same as inviting complete chaos. The detail of how to design for immanence and for encounters without inviting chaos is a science in its own right. And that I do go into detail in the book. The extension of trust and the expansion of the sounding box of the imagination and the sense of unknown potential from the audience, in the audience, that becomes the space in which audiences may experience immersion, not the actual space you put them in. It is the expansion of their imagination and their sense of unknown potential. That's where the sense of awe comes in, that gives the sense of immersion. So they come to be surprised by themselves, not just your designed experience. And thus, if you think your audience in terms of their potential for shape-shifting, in terms of not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing your audience, you are in a much better place to successfully design for immersion, which are a form of sublime encounter in my thinking. It's another screenshot from the third day. The compact that needs to be entered into and then sustained must solicit trust or elicit trust, engaging the audience's willingness to play, as well as honor that trust. Very much a two-way thing. There's no way out of that. That's where I think personally that the thinking of many sort of HCI designers who kind of think that you can make immersion happen to people absolutely goes wrong. They've sort of, I've read many case studies of such work, and they kind of can't work themselves out of that because they don't know how to think audiences in the first place, because they've never worked with live audiences. Live audiences are a very convincing beast. And it becomes very manifestly evident that it is the imagination of your audience that is the sounding box when you work with live, immersed, immanent audiences. So the way to design for these kinds of sublime encounters build around the articulation of intent and the capability to sustain and support that ongoing suspension of disbelief. You've got to tell audiences that I've got you. You can invest in this. You can suspend disbelief. I'm not going to disappoint you. You are going to be supported, amazed, delighted, and we are going to help you sustain this suspension of disbelief throughout. That seems to work really well. It is often best communicated through detail and precision of rendition. You can't tell the audience what you're going to do. It's show, don't tell every time. So here is an installation that was absolutely beautiful by Atsara during the Lumiere 2013 in Durham. Very simple, singlets suspended, absolutely filling the cathedral space. That was the only light in the space, with a little candle inside each. Beautiful. Not fussy. Avoid fussy interaction design. The tech and your plans, your clever plans and buttons, that should never be the star in the ensemble. Your focus should be the creation of encounters and the possibility of the audience extending their imagination, expanding their sounding box, the sounding box of their imagination towards yours. So this is what Rancière means when he talks about scenes of dissensus. And referring back to what I said right at the beginning, it's not about necessarily being huge. Big, yes, of course, it can certainly help create a sense of awe and vertigo, but the scale the main thing about the scale, it needs to be relevant to your design scheme. You can find these kinds of imaginary spaces inside very tiny things as well, which is something Punchdrunk has been working with during the pandemic, sending out little boxes that can unfold miniature worlds within classrooms, for example. So really, I couldn't help not being driven towards the idea of thinking audiences and how not to think audiences, and certainly not in simple demographic terms with predetermined roles. There is so much to not do about that I can't really begin. Better really to think about what we should do if we want the audience to come to be surprised and delighted by their own imagination, by their own themselves. Then we need to think them as shapeshifters. We need to think of the audiences in terms of what they can do, both desirable and undesirable actions, which absolutely is critical if you work with live audiences, because, you know, if you can think about it, they will do it, and how you can accommodate and negotiate either. This is what unequivocally gives audiences, like companies that work with live audiences, the edge when it comes to this type of design. You have a kind of visceral sense of, right, that can go wrong. The audience is a very it's like an elemental force. You have to just deal with it, and that's not something that can be easily replicated when you work in virtual or technological domains. That's one reason. That's another reason I wanted to do this research, to really try and do some knowledge transfer. Here we have Secret Cinema. They are perhaps known to some of you. They have slightly more formulaic design for their events than Punchdrunk, and they tend to culminate in a cinema screening, and audiences obviously come prepared for this, and they come knowing what to expect. Nevertheless, it is really impressive what the audience comes prepared to do and participate. They come with these umbrellas, and the company trusts the audience to bring what they need to realize the vision for their event. Some of them, I mean, the Moulin Rouge was absolutely stunning. The Blade Runner one was great. The Shawshank Redemption one was jaw-dropping. So it's again, it's about that trust. It's about exposing yourself, not your audience so much. You know, we are in a design paradigm in the digital domain where audiences are expected to expose their private data, but what do the designers expose? Precious little. This is a different paradigm where designers, events organizers, designers expose themselves to audiences, to the real possibility of things going wrong, and they don't, for the most part. And, you know, there are obviously schemes and approaches to mitigate when people misbehave. And as I said before, that's an art form in its own right. So a little bit more about things I've been doing during lockdown, which has been quite limited. Together with Anja Neumann and Wendy Bevan-Mogg, we did at Cambridge Digital Humanities, we did a Zoom theatre of Dr. Tulp and the Theatre of Zoom, which we built on a meme that was circulated on Twitter, among other things, where the clinicians in Rembrandt's famous painting were distributed along the top row of Zoom, and the Dr. Tulp and the cadaver was in the center pane. So my colleague Wendy, who is now at UE rather than BU, scripted the whole thing. We worked with Anja as a choreographer and director, and I was producer more or less. We are currently writing and sort of doing the autopsy of the event, as it were, ourselves. That was quite interesting. We had 8 performances over 2 days online in the depth of lockdown, weeks after the Black Lives Matter protests kicked off. So we had to deal with all those events, and there is a recording on Cambridge Digital Humanities website if you're interested, and I can also communicate further about that. Another little project I've been involved in is the Digital Ghost Hunt. That is concluded. That was AHRC project. We worked with heritage venues to embed ghost stories for Key Stage 2 audiences. This was an opportunity to research immersion with children, which is a different object. Immersion does happen to children, and it presents very different ethical considerations. It's children and adults designing for child and adult audiences in the immersive domain are different objects. That is absolutely, I would emphasize that. So we worked specifically with young audiences here, and looking at what type of devices, what type of structures were necessary to make it a hedonic and productive experience for young audiences, and also to benefit, of course, heritage venues, and to work with educational institutions to embed the a kind of opening up of the black box of technology, to de-dramatize technology and put the children in the center of developing these kind of little technological boxes, to get a sense of, to historicize really experience design within architecture, looking at technology as a form of architecture, but keeping the children right at the center of it. A symposium at King's, not the most riveting pictures ever. Looking ahead. So this is a drawing of a universal theatre by Friedrich Kiesler that was never realized, I should say. So this is a vision of space. So in my meanderings in the research and educational domain, I'm looking at space and desire for research purposes, looking at inside and outside, scale and detail, all relevant to the kind of projects I've talked about, but also looking forward a bit. Here we have Kiesler working on a model, and I just love this picture because it sort of embodies that sense of detail, scale, inside, outside, working in the small towards the large. It connects with deep histories in storytelling. So they've looked at cave paintings, and obviously we cannot possibly know what the intent was when the artists made these paintings. But I'm sure you've come across these superimpositions of the different renditions of the neck and the head, that you can find them at these links as well. This particular team of researchers looks at this as a possible early animation within the context of caves. So they're looking at the lighting conditions and thinking about the possibility, speculating, of course, that the types of lighting that were available, that was available at the time, handheld, perhaps, wax or oil candles, would have thrown a sort of a moving, shifting panoply of shadows and bringing these animal renditions to life as very, very early animations. It's certainly a compelling vision. Whether it's real in the actual historical sense, we will never know. It's certainly a very interesting idea. This is a little disc, 14 to 21,000 years old. They call them a thermotrope. They weren't quite sure what it was, and then somebody had the bright idea to stick a string through it and spin it. And, well, it's quite compelling, I think. So for this purpose, I'm kind of thinking people as homo relatus, storytelling man, something that connects us all. And I'm sort of embracing the speculative here when I say that I can connect with the possibility that the maker of this little disc was telling a story, perhaps to a child, wanting to do something that just amused, something that delighted. I'm not sure I could do that. I'm not sure I could carve in bone something with that kind of life and detail. Either way, it communicates to me. The texture of it communicates, the intent communicates. And there's something deeply moving in this movement across time and spaces, as long as we understand that, yes, we are in the world of story. We're not necessarily talking about that. We cannot know what happened. But in the world of storytelling and being clear about the bounds of storytelling, the bounds of play, the structures of story, that we can operate in this domain sort of next door to science, next door to rigorous, completely evidence-based archaeological research. I think it's important to draw nourishment from it. We should never confuse our sources, of course, but we can nevertheless be inspired by the idea that we can communicate not just across time, but also across interfaces. So I started thinking about this idea of audiences as a material, which sounds terribly abstract, but when you work with live events, and I used to work with festivals with up to 200,000 people, it is the only thing that makes sense. Your audiences are your material. They're physically, viscerally present. And the possibility that, you are so small in relation to them, it really is a kind of sublime from you, the maker's point of view as well. And you do expose yourself. And it's very obvious that a crowd is not the same as a multitude of individuals, and an individual is not, at the ontological level, a subdivision of a crowd. You relate differently to a crowd and an individual. You can't just scale how you think and address an individual when you address or think about a crowd. It doesn't operate, it doesn't function. For design purposes, it's absolutely useless. A crowd has its own ontology. And here, De Certo's image of metaphorai from the Greek is interesting. It frames live embodied audiences as story vehicles that mediate between place and space. For those of you who know De Certo, place is about the idea of placing, limiting, framing, placer, putting in its proper place. So it's again related to the idea of boundaries. Space is a quality that is expansive, emergent, that is created immanently through expansion. So place and space has a similar relationship to boundaries and play, or structure and free play. So these types of concepts, theoretical as they may be, get a physical form. They are manifest when you work with large crowds and live events. So audience agency as a material, how could we then bring that knowledge back into the digital domain and think usefully, meaningfully about it for the purpose of design? It raises important questions about sovereignty of the designer, design, the space, and the audience. It questions the idea of online identities and the focus on stereotypes when you model your audience for the purpose of designing in the virtual domain. It certainly presents an alternative to privacy, data predation, and brokering, and the invasion of privacy that we know is prevalent on free at the point of use platforms. It offers a potential possibility to sustainability in the very broadest sense, because the polarization of public discourses that stem from the incentivization mechanisms created on these platforms it just doesn't seem very, very sustainable to me. So in the interest of preserving and sustaining public discourses, society, democracy, and so forth, I think there are both ethical and sustainability dimensions that are interesting. So we're thinking audiences as agents, not as agents rather, but in terms of their agency as material for the audience user, designer, platform provider, infrastructures. And these kinds of questions led me to have a chat with Professor Anna Wåhlin at Gothenburg University, she's an oceanographer. So I will not go into great detail here. I'm just going to show you a little bit of our ontological meanderings. So bridging the physical and the virtual, so taking the experiences and the knowledge generated from working with live physical audiences into the virtual. If the sublime is an experience of temporary dissolution and expansion of the quotidian experience of self, we propose that methods that encroach and inscribe a reductive image on the quotidian self are unlikely to be productive. And the research I've done with Punchdrunk and other arts organizations indicate that functional audience modeling does not need and may indeed be augmented by not knowing about the individual. individual, not imposing on the individual, not assuming that you know the individual, not assuming that you know your audiences. In fact, regard them as shapeshifters, if anything, in stark contrast with the personalization paradigm. So the objective is a prototype or simulation of virtual human movements at scale in interactive digital systems for exploring how modeling agency rather than agents could affect social behaviors over time. So we're still very, 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 very early days. We're looking at a shared ontology and a pragmatic epistemology. So we're wanting to look at this beyond demographic categories or stereotypes. We want to afford emergence. We want to respect privacy, and we want it to be relevant to critical infrastructures. And this entails representation and incentivization questions that are sort of knock-on effects of how you build code infrastructures. Core concepts, so in Eulerian and Lagrangian computational fluid dynamics, we already have a nice difference that can be a model for doing it as it's done now by following particles of water, or doing it as Anna and I are proposing by looking at bodies of water. So I'm not going to go into great detail because I really don't think we have that time. But important parallels here. Gravity can be a proxy also in audience modeling. So we're proposing here that it's analogous to convention, tradition, and cultural patterning that supports continuity of association and behavior. Friction could be analogous to challenge, resistance, diversion, and distraction within an interactive system. We're going to leave the Coriolis force because that's not really relevant to our particular model. We're looking at different ways of translating algorithms in oceanography to see how they can be relevant to describing human behaviors in modeled spaces. Remember that the spaces are virtual, the audiences are virtual. This is a model. It really, there's no reason at any point to limit ourselves to modeling individuals. Hence the choice for fluid dynamic, where you have these two different approaches already. So this is just a little bit more about the previous slide. And a little bit more again. I can certainly go into nerddom with this, but I'm not going to on this occasion. So zooming out a little bit, whilst I keep talking about the idea of of immanence, when it comes to building models, higher abstraction can help us across the two domains and find a way that might work is what we're proposing. So we're looking to describe physical phenomena in different domains to model system uses without data gathering at the level of individual profiles. And we want to be able to incorporate user interactions without relying on stereotypes at the level of individual profiles in order to develop alternative monetization and incentivization models than those that currently dominate. And then, based on that, we would like to model what the knock-on effects are. So it's quite involved and very slow work, but it's something that keeps me up and out off the street. In tandem with this, I'm working on the design of BA Immersive Media, which is looking to integrate immersive technologies and cross-platform media to produce effective storytellers, producers, script writers, project managers, and project designers. We're looking to fall in line with the BU's established fusion model and student-driven engagement with specialist techniques. We want to produce generalists who can work with specialists, and we want them to be effective storytellers in a fast-moving, non-linear production environment. So based on the kind of principles that I've been talking about, we don't want to limit them to technologies. We want them to be platform agnostic and understand storytelling, spatial experience, and what immersion is as a historical phenomenon. Bridging the physical and the virtual is a key thing, and how it's not in that It's not in the that, it's the how, really. And that's what my research with Punch Drunk has really pointed to. The idea that we can just create a proxy and that that's going to work is it's a very bankable idea perhaps, but not from the audience's point of view. There's absolutely no guarantee that it's going to work. The proof is in the pudding. It doesn't work for the audience. And I mean, they've been trying to sell virtual reality so many times, and now we have Meta trying it again, thinking like, okay, we just do it again. We just throw more money at it. Like, okay, can we just go back to how to do it intelligently before we, that's really my point of view. So we're looking at cross-platform, transmedia, all this familiar stuff, VR, AR, XR, convergence, but of course, the bridge is storytelling. And storytelling is about human experience, human creativity, human collaboration, and human meaning making. And if you don't factor that in, you're not going to get your audience to enter into that compact. You need to respect their agency. You need to factor in their agency. You need to invite their agency. You need to meet them with the same. You need to commit. You need to show across the interface that you are there supporting their investment. A very different way of thinking about immersion. And we're looking to incorporate it in the fusion model. We are supported by leading industry experts, and obviously the curriculum is an emergent phenomenon as well. But we have some key characters, key components, a vocabulary of space and experience through practice. Just going to skip that over. I want to show you some images of interesting ways to work with models and the idea of details. This scrappy sort of aquarium photographs here. Look at the photographs. There is something in there that is just captivating because of the detail, because of the realness of it, because of the slight messiness of it. It translates in the making to something that is quite magical. So we can trace components of this, but there's an otherness to this kind of work that I think makes physical making very relevant to teaching immersion. We saw the photograph of the theatre designer inside the cave there, for example. The anchoring to physical reality creates a kind of intelligence when it comes to working with audiences and spaces that it's really hard to do without. You just need to walk the walk. I personally love models. Playing around with spaces, tiny spaces, and making them look huge, and the projecting your imagination into tiny spaces is something that can be just as awe-inspiring as your romantic landscape and your chasms and your Grand Canyons and whatnot. Is another quite amazing installation. This is a model. Yeah, so those little people there are not real. But there's something really, I don't know, I just love working between very small spaces to very large spaces and experimenting with scale and the human body. This is again a miniature. Those people are not actually in there, but the idea of this being a huge space is of course very exciting. So these are some of the qualities that we're looking to encourage and foster: generalists who can work with specialists, a visceral sense of effective space and time-based experience design, a keen sense of audience perspective, attention to texture, detail, scale, proportions, a broad understanding of media and visualization techniques, understanding of and ability to manage often non-linear production environments, and a strong focus on collaborative and co-creative production expertise. The buzzwords. But yeah, important questions. Does it do what I think it does at the site where it matters, which is inside the audience, right? It's really important to understand your audience and to know that that is the site where immersion happens. Is my audience understanding this in a way that is meaningful? We want them to be technology agnostic in order to future-proof their careers and to keep a focus on storytelling that is keeps the story and its reception in focus. Of course, resilience to challenge. And here our industry specialists like Punch Drunk, etc., are incredible models, really, who can turn a live event into a 12-hour streamed television event for a worldwide audience in the space of 3 months. Embracing limitations as an invitation to play goes right to the heart of immersive design, immersion as a sublime aesthetic. That's something where I probably want to finish so that we have some time for questions.